The morning sun glistened across the still waters of Daniel's private lake, a place that had been in his family for generations. It wasn't just a lake to him. It was the heart of his childhood memories, the sanctuary where he found peace after long days, and the legacy he intended to protect. Yet peace rarely lasts when control-hungry neighbors smell authority. As Daniel stepped out of his cabin with a towel draped over his shoulder, ready for a quiet swim, he noticed a figure waiting at the edge of his driveway. Karen, the head of the local HOA, stood tall in her sharp blazer, arms crossed and lips curled in disapproval. "Daniel," she called, her voice carrying the edge of superiority. "You're in violation of HOA rules. No swimming allowed without approval." Daniel froze. He had heard of Karen's antics with other neighbors, but never imagined she would cross into his property. He calmly reminded her, "Karen, this is my lake. It's private property, not HOA land." Karen smirked and handed him a paper. "Consider this your first fine. $1,000. His heart sank, not because of the money, but because it was clear this wasn't about rules. It was about control. What Karen didn't know was that Daniel wasn't just a homeowner. He also happened to hold a very different kind of power. A power that would soon turn her smug confidence into sheer panic. Daniel sat at his wooden desk that evening, staring at the fine notice. $1,000, written in bold black ink, with threats of legal action if unpaid. The arrogance of it made his blood boil, yet he forced himself to remain calm. Karen had bullied countless families in the HOA, draining them with fines until they either paid or gave up their homes. But Daniel was not just another target. The irony was sharp. His family had owned the lake long before the HOA even existed. The community was built around his land, and when they begged him for easements and access, he had graciously granted limited use. But Karen, blind with power, had twisted that generosity into entitlement. As the night grew darker, Daniel pulled out the thick leather-bound folder where he kept his property deeds and legal agreements. Page after page confirmed what he already knew. The HOA existed because he allowed it. Without his consent, their very foundation would crumble. A storm brewed outside, wind whistling through the trees, almost echoing the storm inside his chest. He decided then he would no longer be quiet. Karen had crossed the line, and he would use every ounce of authority he had to remind her that no one, not even the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, was above the truth. The next morning, Daniel walked into the community hall where the monthly HOA meeting was underway. Karen stood at the head of the table, her voice echoing as she discussed new fees for residents. Families sat nervously, scribbling notes, afraid to question her authority. When Daniel stepped inside, the room fell silent. He carried a slim leather case under his arm, his calm presence making Karen's smug grin falter for the first time. "Well, well, Daniel," she sneered. "Did you come to pay your fine?" "No," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the tension. "I came to remind you whose lake you think you own." He laid the property documents on the table, pages stamped with official seals. Gasps filled the room as he read aloud the clauses confirming his sole ownership, not just of the lake, but of the land beneath the HOA's parking lot. Karen's face reddened, but she forced a laugh. "Paper means nothing," she spat. "I make the rules here." Daniel leaned closer, his tone steady but sharp. "Karen, you don't make rules on my property. You trespassed when you fined me. And if you want to talk about money, then let's talk about your HOA fees." The room shifted, eyes wide, as if they all sensed the turning tide. Karen's empire of fear had just cracked. For days, whispers spread across the neighborhood. Families who once cowered under Karen's iron grip began to approach Daniel privately, thanking him for standing up to her. Stories poured in, fines for flowers planted without approval, threats for leaving holiday lights up too long, even penalties for parking in their own driveways. Daniel listened patiently, but inside he grew more determined. Karen wasn't just misusing authority. She was exploiting it. He knew she had padded HOA budgets with hidden fees, redirecting funds where no one could trace. But now, the same families she had silenced were looking to him for change. At the next HOA board gathering, Karen tried to regain control, banging her gavel loudly. "The rules keep this community in order," she shouted. But her voice cracked, her eyes darting nervously as Daniel stood in the back of the room. Calm, collected. He didn't need to raise his voice. His presence alone shifted the balance. The people were no longer afraid. And as Karen ranted about order, Daniel opened his folder again, this time showing documents outlining his legal right to set easement fees for community use of the lake and lot. If Karen thought a $1,000 fine would break him, she was about to learn the cost of arrogance. 5,000 times over. The announcement dropped like a thunderclap. Effective immediately, Daniel declared, "All HOA fees connected to the use of my property, your lake access, your parking lot, will increase by $5,000 annually." Gasps, murmurs, and even a few cheers erupted in the room. Karen shot to her feet, pointing a trembling finger. "You can't do this," she shrieked. But Daniel remained unshaken. "I already have. These documents give me every right. For years, I've allowed this community to use my land at a fraction of its worth. But if my generosity is going to be abused, then I'll set a fair price." Karen's face went pale. She knew the HOA's survival depended on those easements. Without them, families would revolt, and her throne would collapse. She tried to protest, but no one supported her. Even her closest allies shifted uncomfortably, realizing they had no power against Daniel's undeniable ownership. Daniel didn't smile. He wasn't gloating. This wasn't revenge, it was justice. For every family she had pushed to the brink, for every unfair dollar she had taken, the scales had finally tipped. And Karen was on the losing end. Within weeks, the HOA was in chaos. Families demanded answers as fees skyrocketed. Some turned against Karen openly, accusing her of creating the mess by provoking Daniel. She tried to spin lies, claiming he was greedy, but the truth was clear. His documents were ironclad, and her arrogance had invited her downfall. One by one, board members resigned. Meetings that once echoed with Karen's authority now dissolved into shouting matches, her voice drowned out by neighbors who had finally found their courage. The same people who had lived in fear under her rule were now openly laughing at her desperate attempts to cling to power. Daniel watched quietly, never raising his voice. Justice didn't require anger. It required patience and resolve. He had both. Karen, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, now sat alone in her corner, a crumpled version of herself. And Daniel knew, sometimes the greatest victories aren't won by force, but by letting truth and time dismantle the lies. Months later, the community looked different. Families smiled more, children played freely by the lake, and the air felt lighter without the shadow of Karen's rule. The new HOA board worked fairly, respecting the property lines and rights that Daniel had fought to protect. On a warm summer evening, Daniel swam across his lake, the same way he had before this battle began. As he floated on his back, watching the clouds drift across the sky, he thought about how close Karen had come to rewriting his family's legacy. But in the end, truth had prevailed. Back at his cabin porch, he sipped coffee as the sun dipped low, casting golden ripples across the water. His lake was his again, untouched, unquestioned. Karen had tried to fine him for living his truth, but all she had done was remind him of the power he held. A $1,000 insult had cost her $5,000 in return. And Daniel smiled, knowing peace wasn't given. It was claimed, defended, and cherished.